This week on Dialogue, Outlier States, American Strategies to Change, Contain, or Engage Regimes. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, our guest is Robert Litvak. Rob is the Wilson Center's Vice President for Scholars and Academic Relations and Director of its International Security Studies program. Previously, Dr. Litvak served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Non-Proliferation during the first Clinton administration. His newest book is Outlier States, American Strategies to Change, Contain, or Engage Regimes, and that's what we'll be discussing today. Rob, welcome back to Dialogue.
Thank you, John.
I want to ask you, Rob, early in the book you say that this is the third in an unintended series. Explain that. How unintended? How
well,
so?
The term rogue state entered the U.S. foreign policy lexicon after the Cold War. I was working on the National Security Council staff, and the Clinton administration asserted that these rogue states, which were defined as states pursuing weapons of mass destruction and using terrorism as an instrument of state policy, constituted a distinct category of states in the international system. So when I returned to the Wilson Center from working at the White House, I wanted to write a book about that experience, not a there I was on Tuesday kind of book, but sort of looking at these concepts and how they're translated into policies and how those policies can lead to some contradictions. So the first book was really, where did the term rogue state come from? How did it get translated into policy? That was published in 2000 and had got some traction in the policy debate. The Clinton administration jettisoned the term rogue state, realizing that it had become a political straitjacket, that once you relegated these states to that category, the normal diplomacy was complicated because these states were by definition beyond the pale. Then after 9/11, the George W. Bush administration shifted from an emphasis on containing these so-called rogue states to changing them, because after 9/11 the notion was that the concept was that the threat these states posed derived from their very nature, so that if you wanted to turn off the rogue behavior, you had to change rogue regimes. And that led to the second book, which was Regime Change, published in 2007, which focused on this shift from containment to regime change, as was done in Iraq. And where that book ended was that the Bush administration was facing nuclear challenges with Iran and North Korea, and it couldn't apply the Iraq model to them. And because they were in the rogue category, the Bush administration was hesitant to offer them the kind of security assurance which was offered to Libya to get them to give up their unconventional weapons. So they were caught in this tension, and that's really where I left it in the second book, Regime Change. This third book, Outlier States, picks up on the transition from Bush to Obama. And Obama has, in a deliberate move, has referred to these states as outliers, meaning that if they come into compliance with international norms, they can be brought back into the community of nations, reintegrated into them. It offers them a pathway, this choice of they could be integrated or they can be isolated. And that was a fundamental reframing of the issue between Bush and Obama.
And you make the point, I think quoting Dan Moynihan, that this isn't just rhetorical or political speak, that what we call things influences how we think about them.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase you're referring to is, Senator Moynihan had said, how we think about the world affects how we act in the world. And it's not some kind of fetishism about language, but it's rather that these categories sort of drive the policies. And hence, one's taking a deeper dive behind the terms to unpack them. What do they mean and what are the implications of them?
But whether rogue state or outlier, these are US designations, correct? There's no precedent in international law or political science?
Well, interestingly, there are a variety of terms that policymakers and policy analysts have used to describe states. None really have the standing of international law, outlaw state or outlier state or whatever. But I think what is significant in this reset from Bush to Obama was that Obama cast the issue of Iran and North Korea in terms of their conduct that violates established international norms. with respect to proliferation or terrorism. So that the beef, so to speak, is not with the United States. It's the problem that these states have with the international community, and it's just not the United States.
And this focus on the character of regimes that emerged in the post-9/11 world through the George Bush view of the world. You referenced this notion of Wilsonianism in boots.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Well, that term, Wilsonianism in boots, was how they described the kind of the neoconservative trend after 9/11, which was an assertive policy. Someone referred to it as coercive democratization. I mean, it was exemplified in the Iraq War, of going to war against a rogue regime that was preventive. It was, you know, Saddam's Iraq was not an imminent threat to the United States, but it was viewed in, as Secretary Rumsfeld put it, through the prism of 9/11. So the administration, you know, pursued coercive non-proliferation, the notion being that Saddam still had some residual WMD capabilities or a desire to reconstitute the forces, but also was a way, it was tied in with this, what the President Bush called the freedom agenda, and the notion that it was Wilsonian in the sense of proliferate democracies and you'll create a Pacific international system.
Mm-hmm. And you referenced the quote, I think by Sandy Berger, about rogue states had become a sloppy convenience, and then so there was a purposeful change away from that topic. But in the May 2010 National Security Strategy in the Obama administration, they reference rules based on international system. Mm-hmm. So again, it's not quite this defining international law, but they do evoke some sort of standards that there is consensus around. Is that accurate? Is there a consensus?
Well, the rogue term was certainly a unilateral American political concept without standing international law. It was applied selectively.
Did our allies adopt it?
Allies did not buy into it. It basically targeted states that were hostile to the United States, so that, you know, Syria, which met all the criteria, WMD possession, state sponsors of terrorism, was not included in the 1990s as a rogue state because the United States needed Syria at the time as part of the Arab-Israel peace diplomacy.
Strategic need got them an asterisk.
So it was applied selectively and was regarded as such. Mm-hmm. The Obama administration, with this rhetoric, you know, the language you've referred to, rules-based international order, et cetera, is trying to recast the issue in terms of international norms. Now, the issue of norms, and I get into this in a fair you know, discussion in the book, it begs the question, you know, well, whose norms?
Right, that's
who
where I'm
sets
headed.
the norms?
Who sets the rules and who enforces the rules?
Well, to a certain degree, perhaps to a considerable degree, the norms of the system are a reflection of the power, the distribution of power in the system at any given time. And here I would highlight the cardinal principle of international relations. I mean, sovereignty. The system is hardwired around the concept of sovereignty, so that you could get some degree of consensus about how states should behave with respect to each other in the system. Saddam Hussein in 1990 violated that cardinal principle by invading Kuwait, essentially murdering another state. And so in the UN Security Council in 1990, there was a consensus to expel Iraq from Kuwait. By contrast, in 2003, George W. Bush could not get UN Security Council authorization because he was arguing controversially that a march on Baghdad to overthrow the regime was the way of bringing it into compliance with norms. So there's been this divide between external and internal. The UN had an interesting debate in 1945 at the time of its creation. Should only democracies be allowed into the United Nations? Should domestic governance and proper treatment of the civilian populace, should that be a criterion for membership? And what was decided was they would not hold how regimes behaved within their borders as a criterion for membership. Because of this crux issue of the issue, which is the concern about sovereignty.
So as long as you behave yourself in your own house or outside your own house, you can do whatever you want within your own borders?
But, and this goes to the question of norms and how they evolve. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been a discussion about kind of responsibility to protect, RPP, for humanitarian intervention. And the question is, what are the bounds? How far can a regime go in the egregious treatment of its own people before an outraged international community should evolve? And from issue from issue to issue, Kosovo, Georgia, and the Ossetian issue, Tibet, Sudan, you see calls for intervention in a state where an ethnic minority is being repressed, and a considerable number of countries, in recent years spearheaded by Russia and China, which jealously guard sovereignty, trying to prevent outside intervention in the domestic affairs of another state. One sees it now, as we speak, in 2012 in the Syrian crisis, as we did a year before in the Libyan crisis, of whether the international community can intervene within a state. Highly controversial in international relations, and it'll always remain so, because we, despite this rhetoric, states are passé and they're transnational forces. The world, Osama bin Laden, okay, he was a non-state actor, okay, but at the end of the day, or at the end of the night when that raid occurred, he was in a state. He was in Pakistan. And there were huge sovereignty issues raised by the U.S. raid there, and it just underscores how, as I put it, the system is hardwired around sovereignty. Not unlimited, but it remains the dominant, principle.
Another observation you make about the system, which may fly in the face of sort of lay conventional wisdom, which 9/11 changed everything. You say it didn't change the structure of international relations; it just changed our perception of threats.
It changed perception of threat, but 9/11 did not change the structure of international relations, and to a considerable degree, it reinforced the existing structure. You had relations between Russia, China, and the United States move to their closest since World War II. I teach a course in international relations at Georgetown, and a good question would be, what theory of international relations would have led Russia to allow overflights to land in Central Asia to take down an adjacent regime in an adjacent country to Russia? Or China could connect the dots. After Al-Qaeda blew up Wall Street, they could see if international capital is slowed down, then Chinese growth might slow down. And if growth goes from X to X minus 2%, you could have millions of people on the street in China with domestic instability. So Russia, China connected the dots, and it led to this reinforcement of the existing system in a way. But what happened afterwards, in the year or two after, was that the United States began to act kind of outside the structure of the institutions and the norms of the system. The decision to invade Iraq, without the legitimizing imprimatur of the UN Security Council, was a move outside that structure. And if I could, I'm here to discuss my own book, Outlier States, but an influential book written at the Wilson Center by the Princeton professor John Eikenberry, After Victory, describes how really and was influential in my own writing, how the American formula for success was this embedding of American power in the institutions and the norms of the system, and that Iraq was really a departure from that. We operated outside of that system, leading to the kind of pushback we saw in the UN Security Council. And just to connect the loop here, what Obama was doing was getting back to that winning game plan by reframing the problem with the outliers in terms of norms, institutions, pathways for states to rejoin the community.
Well, not to be too glib about this, Rob, but in what you describe, and you reference Eikenberry's work as well, are we talking about the top cop becoming an outlier itself?
Well, there was that. I mean, in 2000, there was discussion about that America was this hyperpower.
Last superpower standing.
Last German diplomat referred to us as a super duper power. We had this enormous power, but one didn't see the world balancing against American power because of this embedding function. This is what Professor Eikenberry has persuasively argued. And then this departure in 2003, such that there was a French diplomat who referred to the United States as a rogue superpower, this sort of working outside. So the Obama administration has recast the issue, and in the terms that I discussed in terms of a reference to established international norms, stipulating that the question of norms is a sort of a dynamic one, who sets them, how they're enforced, etc. And that I think successful pivot by the Obama administration is what is responsible for the success that they've had in dealing with the Iran crisis, of getting the permanent 5 members of the United Nations plus Germany, the so-called P5+1, to engage in kind of rigorous, robust multilateral diplomacy backed by multilateral sanctions to bring Iran back to the negotiating table and to coerce them into coming into compliance with their responsibilities under the NPT.
You very effectively in the book categorize the ways in which these outliers or rogues come back into the community of nations. And I'm going to go through the four pathways and ask you to comment on each of them briefly. The assimilation of a defeated great power.
Well, here the prominent case that comes to mind is Germany and Japan after World War II. Those were declared wars and operated within the rules of law governing wars. Germany was an occupied state, a divided state, and the U.S. strategy, and what some has referred to as American grand strategy, was integration. So West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, was democratized and sort of re-socialized and brought in, and that became that base of the Federal Republic of Germany became the anchor to which East Germany then integrated in when the Cold War ended.
The second is evolution of revolutionary states into Orthodox great powers.
Well, here the cases I address are the two of the great revolutionary states of the 20th century, the Soviet Union and China. Kenan, in his famous X article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, said that the United States should contain the Soviet Union to allow a mellowing and its evolution from a revolutionary state into an Orthodox great power. And in 1989, under Gorbachev, Kenan proclaimed the end of the Cold War, that had occurred. And I think one sees a similar arc with China, from Mao to Deng Xiaoping, who was the key kind of reformer in the 70s and 80s, who again managed this transition from revolutionary state to Orthodox great powers. Now, let's be clear, Orthodox great powers, they are not liberal democracies of the European kind. They remain authoritarian states, but neither Russia nor China constitutes a frontal assault on international order in the way they did as revolutionary states. So they're works in progress, but one can see this arc from revolutionary state to Orthodox great power. It's a way of integrating them in. Really, the question is, how do Russia and China integrate into the system? They're not trying to overturn the system.
They're not. What was the term you use? Hostile proliferators, aggressive? What is the?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about on proliferation that the United States asserts a norm against proliferation, but in practice, the United States concerns about states that combine capabilities with hostile intent. So we're not focused on Israel, we're focused on Iran.
The next way into the club is regime change from without.
Well, the cases I focus on there are humanitarian interventions that occurred in the late 70s when Idi Amin's regime, murderous regime in Uganda, was overthrown by Tanzania, and when the Pol Pot regime, which killed some 2 million of its own people in Cambodia, was overturned by Vietnam. The motivations of the intervening states were not purely altruistic, okay, but these were the worst of the worst, and yet in both instances there was considerable pushback from the international community on sovereignty grounds. And of course with Cambodia it was viewed through a Cold War prism as well. Yet Cold War politics overlaying it. But it's amazing that how contentious that intervention was to overthrow a regime that had murdered so many of its own people. And that's that's testimony to how the worst regimes try to hide behind state sovereignty to preclude outside intervention.
Well, it makes sense. You know, the survival of nations depends on respect for sovereignty. And finally, regime change from within.
Regime change from within, I mean, really, historians talk about agency, and the external agency of intervention outside of, Germany is a different case because it was declared war. But these interventions from outside powers to overturn regimes, even murderous regimes, highly contentious on sovereignty grounds. Internal pathways of change are, political scientists use terms like organic and certainly more legitimate. And the two pathways, that I identify are, take a look at the case of South Africa, where in the late 80s, you had a shift of view within the ruling elite, kind of this intra-elite bargaining, where the calculus of decision for the elite, ruling elite, shifted, leading under the white minority leadership to eschew, to give up the apartheid system and to release Nelson Mandela, have him assume leadership. Mandela was sort of a necessary condition for peaceful transition, but not a sufficient one. The key shift was this shift within the white minority elite itself. In Romania in 1989, another interesting case, Ceausescu, one of the worst, and really Romania was the one case of regime change in Eastern Europe during the year of revolutions in Eastern Europe, which was a violent one. I mean, a kind of a Romanov-style execution of the Ceausescu, husband and wife, and it was the one case in which there was like a real, kind of violent change. But the dynamic there was the regime sort of flipped on itself. You had the security services and the army basically flipped on the Ceausescu family, which was viewed as a liability, and that led to it wasn't a pure regime change. It certainly wasn't a revolution. It was sort of a regime change from within.
And in these cases, the external pressures come to bear, but they're not the primary reason that things change.
The external pressure can kind of increase the costs for the ruling regime to kind of stay the course. And the purpose of targeted sanctions, there's been much discussion about general versus targeted, is go after the people within the ruling circle and increase the costs for them. So that, for example, in the Iran sanctions, they're going after revolutionary guards and the top leadership, their bank accounts, etc., to apply a real cost to the conduct that they're responsible for.
A few moments ago, you referenced integration as American grand strategy, and the contradiction here, or not the contradiction, but the complication is that for a lot of these regimes that we're trying to engage, integration is viewed as a threat to their very existence by them.
Yeah. Well, contradiction is it's a word that's appropriate here, and it's used all the time. It was in the old Soviet lexicon. There's a tension there that we offer integration or isolation as the path. Give them a choice: integration or isolation and punitive consequences. The bind is that these states, as your question kind of framed it, drawing from the argument I present in the book, they view the very process of integration as a threat to regime survival.
And we're thinking Iran and North Korea primarily.
That integration offers regime-sustaining economic benefits, but also the risk of regime-threatening political contagion. And it's for that reason, I argue in Outlier states, that with Iran and North Korea, the nuclear issue has become this proxy for this broader question about how they relate to the outside world. And as a consequence, it means that nuclear diplomacy with Iran and North Korea can at best aim to bound the programs, to limit them, but not roll them back, because the nuclear question has this proxy or surrogate status for the broader question with Iran. Is it a revolutionary state or is it an ordinary country? That's unresolved in Tehran. In Pyongyang, does the state want to hang on to its nuclear deterrent, or does it want to use it as a bargaining chip and perhaps give it up to receive economic concessions? So in both countries, there's this, tension between, that integration offers some tangible benefits, but also this extreme risk, and that's where we're caught now, and it's the reason why. And maybe that's where you're going in your next question.
See if you can guess what the next question.
Which is, we're pursuing a policy of containment.
Right.
Yeah.
We're back to Kenan, we're back to containment,
yeah.
And you think that in a world of imperfect options, this is our best option?
I think in a world where, and look, we're not talking law of thermodynamics here. There's no right answer.
Right.
Okay, you just have to make an assessment of risk and what level of risk you're willing to tolerate, and what pathway might be most effective given the character of the regime. And my conclusion is that in a context where engagement has limits for the reasons we just discussed, that integration is a threat to them as much as anything else, and where the military option is severely constrained, and I can discuss the reasons for that. The containment is, I don't think this phrase appears in the book, but if integration is America's sort of grand strategy, containment is the default alternative when integration is not possible.
Well, Kenan's strategy was based on a prediction or prophecy of how the Cold War would end.
Mm-hmm.
How do you apply that model to this version of containment?
I'm a comparativist. I've worked across a range of cases. I am not a country expert on Iran or Libya. I consume the literature, and I have a section in Outlier States on how you develop strategies, a kind of a qualitative methodology of assessing the character of the state, and then from that analysis, the appropriate strategy derives. For example, in the case of Iran, a driver on military action is this view that the regime is apocalyptic and undeterrable. Well, if that's your read of the country, then military action kind of lines up with that assessment. Alternatively, if you see the Iranian regime is motivated by some type of cost-benefit analysis, and here I draw on the national intelligence estimates that have been made public. This is the U.S. government assessment that that is not an apocalyptic, undeterrable regime. There is a cost-benefit analysis. Then the challenge becomes, how do you craft a policy that gets leverage on that calculus of cost and benefit, and the policy, the strategy derives from your concept of the target state and the forces within that society that are potential agents of
well,
change.
Rob, thank you. Another terrific piece of work. Thanks for joining us to discuss it, and good luck with it. I hope it sells as well as it deserves to.
Thank you very much, John.
We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us, and read Outlier States. Thanks.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.